Let's get started. People will pop in, I'm sure, as we go, but being prompt is a good thing, right? Let's start. Well, all our days are busy. Let's get started right now. So we left off last training with pages 1 and 2. Pages 1 and 2 took us an hour. There's a lot of strategy with pages 1 and 2. And today we're trying to get through page 5 of the purchase agreement, pages 3, 4, and 5. So I'll start right away with page 3. If you have questions about a line, here's how we'll hold this training. I'll have an explanation and Pat will weigh in with his take on the line. We'll talk some strategy. And if you have questions about a certain line, then ask your question and we'll try to answer it as best we can. So, okay, line 91, page 3, the date, of course. The date of the offer, 92, property located, full property address. And then I'm going to read lines 93 through 113. Now, there's some debate in the forms committee right now on how to restructure this wording in these paragraphs, which relate to the written statement. As you can, if you remember, in line 78, the buyer shall provide seller a licensee representing the seller with a written statement on or before a certain date, which could be a selection if you're representing the seller. I see sellers counter with this a lot on offers. So this is the definition of the written statement. Upon delivery of the written statement, if this purchase agreement does not close on the stated closing date for any reason related to financing, including but not limited to interest rate and discount points, if any, then seller may, at seller's option, declare this purchase agreement canceled, in which this purchase agreement is canceled. If the seller declares the purchase agreement canceled, buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be forfeited to the seller as liquidated damages. In the alternative, seller may seek all other remedies allowed by law. Now, line 99, notwithstanding the language in the preceding paragraph, don't fall asleep during this explanation, okay? Notwithstanding the language in this preceding paragraph, seller may not declare this purchase agreement canceled if the reason this purchase agreement does not close was due to A, B, and C. A, seller's failure to complete work orders to the extent required by the purchase agreement. B, seller's failure to complete any other financing terms agreed to be completed by the seller here. Or C, any contingency for the sale of the buyer's property pursuant to this purchase agreement, except as specified in the contingency for sale and closing of the buyer's property. Now I'm going to continue and we'll talk about it as soon as I get through line 113. If the written statement is not provided by the date specified in line 79, seller may, at seller's option, declare the purchase agreement canceled by written notice to the buyer at any time prior to the seller receiving the written statement, in which case this purchase agreement is canceled. In the event the seller declares the purchase agreement canceled, buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer. And that's talking about lines 101 through 103, A, B, and C. Now, line 110, if the written statement is not provided and the seller has not previously canceled this purchase agreement is canceled as of the closing date specified in this purchase agreement. Buyer and seller shall immediately sign cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer. Are you guys still awake?
Yeah,
we're here.
This is a long one. This is a long one. So,
well, and it's a complicated piece that throws a lot of people off.
Right. And like I said, Carson, before you hopped on, the forms committee is reworking all this phrasing. So
it's too ambiguous. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't confirm how it's going to come out, but just know that it's in the middle of being reworked. Of course, our take on this is the buyer has outs from this written statement in lines A, B, and C. If the seller fails to do what they said they're going to do, this purchase agreement can be canceled with earnest money refunded to the buyer. Now, the reason this is getting reworked, as Carson said, and Pat, I'm sure will agree, there is some ambiguity in here on written statement, what it is, who it comes from, and what qualifies. And that's what the forms are wrestling with. Pat, do you have a take on this clause, this long phrasing?
Yeah, this has changed over the years a lot, but I want to zoom out if we could, and if you could go back to the prior page.
Yep.
Okay, right here. So there's financing contingency. This whole thing is all about the mortgage financing contingency, and there's two options that are commonly used here. The
Thank you,
first
Pat.
one, check boxes, is one that's popular with buyers. It just basically says that if they can't get their financing, this purchase agreement's canceled and the earnest money is refunded to the buyer in this case. The second option preferred by sellers, that all of these paragraphs that we just went through, basically sellers want to see that things are moving along. And so prior to closing, they want to get a written statement from the buyer's lender. Basically, it describes what it is, but it's basically saying that you're fully approved now with the appraisals done with only these conditions. Okay. And so the zoom out view is, if the buyer can't provide that written statement by the date, then the seller can cancel. Okay. And if they do elect to cancel, then the earnest money goes back to the buyer. Okay. On the other hand, the seller might not choose to cancel. The buyer might say, I'm almost approved, almost approved. Okay. Well, the seller can cancel at any time prior to closing, but they don't have to cancel immediately on that written date. Okay. Alternatively, if the buyer does provide the written statement by that date, then all of the impact goes over to the buyer. The responsibility switches to the buyer. And if the buyer does not close in time, then it's canceled and the buyer loses the earnest money, goes to the seller. So that's more of like a zoom out perspective. With all the work there, it's kind of complicated, but that's the best way that we can zoom it out and look at it.
Well, and Pat, I might, for newer agents, make it even simpler. We're merely stating if we're putting extra teeth and an extra lifting a contingency with that written statement ahead of the closing date, because it leaves it wide open for a buyer to have options based on financing to cancel all the way to the closing without it.
Mm-hmm.
Long one. It's a long one. When in doubt, consult your broker on this one. If you have a deal running up on close date and you don't have a solution and you're on a written statement deadline, talk to us. Let's go through the purchase agreement together. We'll go through what the next steps will be.
Really, really
well,
important.
and this has to be done in conjunction with a lender in most cases, because if we're doing something that's more than 7 days ahead of a closing, or if we've got a closing that's 30 days out and we're trying to pick a written statement lender commitment date, it's tough to do without consulting with the lender. And I will always bring that up with the client, with our agents.
Well, in the thing that the forms committee is dealing with, I'm sure you guys are aware that when you deal with contract language in a contract that relies on a third party outside the contract, it gets complicated. And that's what we're
well
trying to
said.
clarify.
Yeah, and I know that's the complication, because different lenders have different views on what they are needing to provide. There's no hard and fast thing of what a written statement is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well said. Any other thoughts, line 93 through 113 before we move on?
I think it'd be healthy for everyone to move forward.
Yeah, we let off
after all three of us hit on it, and I couldn't find my computer, so I was 3 minutes behind.
we let off with a real dry set of clauses. So let's go to line 114. Locking a mortgage interest rate. Rate shall be locked by the lender or with the lender by buyer. Check one. It's either or. Line 116. Within 5 business days of final acceptance, or 117 at any time prior to closing as required by the lender. Now, it depends on who you're representing, and it all depends on, when we talk strategy in a purchase agreement, there are a lot of moving parts, and a lot of strategy depends on multiple offer situations and client situations. And just know, when we talk about a certain strategy, it may not apply in the situation that you're in. But we see some generalities when it comes to strategy. Like with line 116, I have seen, when you represent a buyer, a seller, depending on the interest rate climate, counteroffer with line 116. When you're submitting an offer for your buyer, they may say, hey, We want you to lock your rate within 5 business days because we want the security of knowing that you're not going to be caught in a rate spike and we're going to lose out on this deal. So line 117, better for buyers. They can lock at any time prior to closing as directed by as required by their lender. As the agent, of course, we're going to talk to the lender and find out what the situation is and make sure that those details are covered earlier than prior to closing, right? I want to make sure the buyer has a mortgage secured for all parties of the transaction way prior to closing. So prior to closing is kind of, I never really agreed with that one, but any questions on 116, 117? Any thoughts, Pat or Carson, on those?
Sometimes the buyers might prefer 116. They just may not have the stomach to float.
Yeah. Like I said,
Right.
it's just, it all depends on those situations. There's so many variables, and especially in today's housing climate. I mean, we're in multiple offers. Back in the day when it was a buyer's market, we were able to structure purchase agreements with a little more
Yes.
leeway towards the buy side to allow negotiating by the list side, negotiate out a couple terms that weren't really important to us anyway, to get some feathers in their cap. And they felt like they had some small wins. And then we got a purchase agreement done, but that doesn't necessarily apply right now just because of the motivation. So you got to
Well said. Well
Yeah.
said. We can't leave any of those blanks out right now because we have to have everything that looks in favor with a seller to make a buyer have an option.
That's right. In a lot of cases, it's a one-shot deal in today's market with low inventory of getting an offer accepted. So to weigh it heavy on the buy side with some things that aren't important might behoove you in getting an offer accepted. So let's go on to line 118. Lender commitment work orders. Seller agrees to pay up to X dollars to make repairs as required by the lender commitment. If the lender commitment is subject to any work orders for which the cost of making said repairs shall exceed this amount, seller shall have the following options. 121, option A is making necessary repairs. Option B is negotiating the cost of making said repairs with the buyer. Option C, declaring the purchase agreement canceled, in which the purchase agreement is canceled. Buyer and seller shall sign a cancellation confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer unless the buyer provides for payment of the cost of said repairs or escrow amounts related thereto above the amount specified on line 118 of this purchase agreement. Okay.
Oh, man.
Yeah, right. That's a mouthful. Well, that's contract language.
Could I simplify it in one
Go ahead,
phrase?
Carson. Go ahead, Carson.
Okay, the dollar value that Nick read off the blank is a pre-negotiated amount that is being asked of the sellers to contribute if there are work orders. And it almost never happens unless it's an FHA or a VA loan.
Right.
And it depends on the condition of the property, but the challenge is that sellers will see that dollar amount, let's say it's $1,000 or whatever, and they may, even though it's very unlikely that it's going to be called out, they may automatically kind of deduct that from the price that they're getting,
Yeah.
There's been a lot of instances where I've had to explain to a seller that that's not an automatic 500 or not an automatic 250. This is only if the Govy, FHA, VA, USDA appraiser flags a repair. And when you are in this business long enough and represent Govy buyers more often, you'll get to be able to see condition ahead of time on a property and kind of know what's going to happen with that appraiser. And if they might, they flag what Pat and Carson, peeling paint, unfinished projects, bad window, broken window seals, bad roofs. There's a couple things that they always routinely flag. So as listing agents, we can try to help the seller avoid a trip up in the financing process by making sure they get most of this stuff done. And of course, in today's real estate climate, FHA, VA, Govy buyers have a disadvantage a lot of times when it comes to landing property in this market, because listing agents and sellers know that those financing types are a little more stringent in their requirements for condition. Now, I used to build money in here every time for a buyer, 250, if it was 250 or 500. But just like Pat said, the seller's going to see that and mentally, they almost automatically deduct that from their net proceeds, which isn't true. So why even have the discussion, you know, because what in the real world, what's going to happen if you put 0 in there, the appraiser is going to flag a repair and the buyer and seller are going to have to talk about it anyway. Whether the seller repairs it, the seller pays for it, or the buyer repairs it, or the buyer pays for it, or they split it, or the purchase agreement goes away, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. They always ask the seller first. It's always kind of like an expectation, but
Yeah.
the purchase agreement, you know, it basically says if you got 0 in there, it's like no one's agreed to it, you know, in advance.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, and if we look at what the common repairs are, it's usually scraping and painting, a piece of siding that's missing. You know, you could get ahead of this clause in the purchase agreement as a buyer's agent by thoroughly going through that property with your buyer and just kind of knowing ahead of time what's going to be flagged. And sometimes pre-negotiating that stuff in the offer, because you know it's going to come up. And then you can have that conversation with the listing agent and say, hey, I know those windows on the south side are going to get flagged by FHA. Is there any way we can get that done ahead of time? And that'll alleviate a lot of this pain. So
I'm just going to throw something out here real quick. If you do a lot of transactions, you know, eventually you're going to find a situation where there might be work orders, and you may have a seller that's not capable of doing anything. You may have a really handy buyer, and you may have someone suggest to you that, oh, the buyer can go and do the stuff. That's really risky for a number of reasons. It's really risky to have buyers do repairs in advance, you know, potential liability for the sellers, all that stuff. What if it doesn't close? There's a risk there. So again, talk to us in that kind of a situation.
Yep. And in some cases, correct me if I'm wrong, Pat and Carson, an escrow agreement can sometimes fix those problems if agreeable by the lender.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Challenges with escrow agreements, if it's a work order, the title companies pretty much are always willing to hold that money.
Yeah.
If it's not a work order, oftentimes they're not willing to hold the money. Then you got to have one of the real estate companies hold the money. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't like it when our company's holding lots of different things in escrow.
That's right. That's right.
Well,
Risk management.
some of you may have heard me as a broker say we try our best to avoid escrows.
Yeah.
They're a last option typically.
Yeah, and typically it's 1.5 times the repair amount of multiple bids. It's complicated, right? Don't go there if you don't have to.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's the only way you can get a deal done, and that's how it is. Okay. Any other questions? Line 118 through 126. Commitment work orders. I think we beat that one to death. Huh?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Let's go line 127. And this is an either or. Seller or buyer agrees to pay any reinspection fee required by the buyer's lender. Now, typically that reinspection fee is paid to the appraiser, because the appraiser has to go back out on the buy side and verify that the agreed upon repairs were complete before closing. And they usually charge for it. So you have to decide at this point, what is the seller gonna like to see in this offer? Are they gonna see this as another charge? Like Pat mentioned, any money in line 118, they're gonna think comes right off of their bottom line. And then line 127, I mean, they're automatically gonna think there's $140 or whatever the reinspection fees are lately, that's gonna come off their bottom line. So think about that when you structure it off. A lot of times buyers just pay for it. It's due to their own financing, but that item is negotiable. Okay. Line 128, FHA escape clause, FHA financing only. Okay, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract, the purchaser shall not be obligated to complete this purchase of the property described here, or to incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposits or otherwise, unless the purchaser has been given, in accordance with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, FHA or DVA requirements, a written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner, Department of Veterans Affairs, or a direct endorsement lender setting forth the appraised value of the property not less than X. Okay, this will be, you'll see this FHA escape clause, usually it'll come in a separate addenda, right, guys? When you have an FHA or VA, we typically see a whole page addenda come with this same language that usually gets signed after an offer has been accepted, but it is in the purchase agreement. What are you guys seeing out there?
Anyone?
Nothing. Nobody's seen anything. Okay. No. So basically this says that FHA has an escape clause saying if it doesn't appraise for the offer amount or the sale or whatever price is put in line 133. So a lot of times that price in 133 should mirror the offer price. So you got to think about this now when you're countering. When you're countering on price, you got to counter on line 133 as well. But typically a lender will reply after an FHA offer gets accepted with a supplemental addenda saying the exact same thing. So just verify
It's
with the lender.
quite redundant.
It is. It is. And okay. Any questions on FHA escape clause and how they function? Nope. All right, let's move on. Line 134, the purchaser shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of the appraised valuation. The appraised valuation is arrived at to determine the maximum mortgage HUD will insure. HUD will not warrant the value nor condition of the property. The purchaser should satisfy himself or herself that the price and condition of the property are acceptable. Meaning, the buyer can still buy it, but they have to, typically, they don't say this in such language, typically they have to make up the difference. So if it's a 300 offer and it comes in at 310, or excuse me, 290, where's the extra 10 going to come from? Because HUD's going to want security on that 10, right? So then they got to figure out the difference. So it basically says the buyer can still buy it, but I think there are going to be some other strings. Thoughts on that? Anyone?
Well, I'm going to add that this is where you hear a lot in multiple offer situations where buyers offer to, in advance, cover any appraisal gaps. And so that would be an additional term written into the purchase agreement where the buyer is basically saying, I'll cover an appraisal gap up to a certain dollar amount, essentially. The other thing I want to point out is an escape clause like this isn't in the standard wording for a conventional offer. Okay. And so if there's an appraisal gap with a conventional offer, a seller might argue that you're not protected here with an escape clause to the buyer. Okay. Now, of course, the buyer might be in a financial circumstance where they just don't have enough cash to cover that, and then they're not going to qualify for their financing altogether. And they might say, well, I can get out because I've got the financing contingency, but these are things to think about in advance and discuss with your buyer.
On Pat's point, when I used to write conventional offers, due to them not having a clause like this, I used to write my own clause on an appraisal. Right, guys? Property must appraise, whatever the clause is written. Even in a conventional offer, the buyer had an option if it didn't appraise. Because the way the contract is written, they still have to move forward.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
So.
Well, and we had a lot of people who presented the idea that with an FHA, with an amendatory clause, that they don't have the option of moving forward with additional cash, but they do. It's just giving a flagged out warning that they can back out.
Yeah, gives them an option. That's right. Okay, let's go. Well, there's page 3, right? That only took us 20 minutes. Let's go on to page 4, line 138, date, obviously line 139, just like every page, the address, full address. If you put it in dot loop in the view details screen, when you first set up the contracts, it'll all pre-populate for you. Okay, line 140, lender processing fees, FHA, DVA financing only. Seller agrees to pay buyer's closing fees and miscellaneous processing fees, which cannot be charged to the buyer, not to exceed X dollars. This amount is in addition to seller contribution to buyer's closing costs, if applicable. Now, I wish a lender was on here.
I know, because this needs a lender, particularly if it's VA.
Years ago, VA did have a fee that the buyer couldn't pay. And I don't know if they do that anymore. Do you guys know that?
I just remember VA. I don't think I ever remember FHA having those fees.
Just
that the buyer
VA. Yep.
paid.
No,
just VA.
I don't recall a specific fee that gets handed over to the seller, but if there are any specific fees, they cannot be paid by the buyer. So it's a little dicey with a VA deal.
I had an instance in one of my early transactions where we were at the closing table and there was such a fee, and the sellers flipped their lids. I represented the buyer. The sellers flipped their lids, and the listing agent was at the table, started crying. And
Oh.
then, I said, let's step out of the room, because this is back when we did all the closings together. Sellers, buyers, agents, lender, title, everybody was in the same room.
Yeah, wow.
So we stepped outside and, in tears, and she, will you split the fee with me? And you know what? I had to say no. I said, it was in the contract. You should know it was in there. You guys
Yeah.
signed it. And she ended up writing that fee for her seller because her seller was so angry about it. And that's just because the seller wasn't explained
Yeah.
on a VA finance. That's what was going to happen. So lesson learned, set everybody up with a good expectation of how the contract works. And that's why we're going through it line by line together, which right now may seem a little boring, but when you get in those situations, you can stand with some confidence in your education and know that you know how this contract works, where a lot of people don't. So, okay. Any questions on lender processing fees? Kind of maybe something that may go away, Carson, Pat, I'm not sure. We'll have to see.
I wonder. Yeah.
I just don't do a lot of VA loans,
No.
Yeah.
We do a lot more up north due to the air base being close by and some other, what am I thinking of? The Guard, National Guard,
Yeah,
other things
right.
there.
I know Theo has one going on where it's lovely because the sellers have a VA loan, so they're happy and understand what the buyer's requirements are.
Yep.
That's a
Well,
unusual coincidence.
and when writing offers, we see that if the seller has past service or is a veteran, and the buyer has past service or is a veteran, and that is clearly seen by both parties, they seem to have a connection. And that seems to really emotionally push them closer together, regardless of contract. They want to sell to somebody like them. So, and I think in some cases, a lot of times that seller bought from somebody that was like them and want to sell to somebody that was like them. So I've seen those happen too, where you write a nice buyer letter, seems to work. I'm going to shut my door. Can you guys hang on a second?
Yep.
Okay.
See, I just want to bring something up while it's in my mind, because we're talking about financing. And of course, we always need to, when we're repping a buyer, look on the listing, on the MLS, and see what kind of terms are being offered. Because you will see sometimes that FHA or VA is not being offered. Maybe it's a condo or something where it's just simply not allowed. Or maybe it's just a house where the seller has decided they just don't want to deal with an FHA offer, and so we need to look at that. And, maybe if it's a house and the condition's not that bad, maybe have a conversation with the listing agent in advance about why that's not listed as a term.
Good
Good
point.
point.
Well,
Yeah.
and a lot of times too, FHA has what is it called? A 203K rehab program that only some lenders offer, that is still technically an FHA program, but they specialize in rehabbing property. So it's complicated and the process is lengthy, and some lenders just don't even want to do it because of the process and contractors and reimbursements, but it's still out there.
There's a few conventional purchase rehab programs as well. It's
so many programs.
Aware of these.
Yeah, we should just have a list of programs that we can all reference, because there are so many with so many different lenders.
Yeah.
So, okay. DVA funding fee, line 143. DVA financing only pursuant to federal regulations. A one-time funding fee based on the loan amount must be paid at closing of this transaction as follows. So this is the VA funding fee, and this can be negotiated, paid by buyer, paid by seller at closing, or added a mortgage amount. Now, there is no standard here, but it is negotiable. And in a lot of cases, if I'm right, and it used to be this way, if the vet, person applying with VA financing, is 10% disabled or more, the funding fee, there's a funding fee waiver. And that's, I think, driven by, what's the document, like the DD 214.
Oh, wow.
I can't remember what the document is. We've done a lot of these. And so sometimes there's a funding waiver. So talk to the lender if you have a VA client with a rated disability. Sometimes that funding fee can be waived. So you have to structure this. Go ahead, Carson.
Oh, no, I've seen them rolled into the mortgage more commonly in this
Yeah.
market.
Yeah. Because
And it's not a big number.
well, it's 1%, isn't it, Carson?
Yeah, I mean, it's big in the upfront cost, yes. So
Yeah,
rolling
yeah.
into the mortgage adds
Yeah.
a smaller thing to digest.
So this may be something, if you have a VA buyer, you want to talk to the lender about and how that should be structured. And also, just like I said in the beginning, depending on what kind of situation you're in on making an offer, if it's multiple offer or depends on the motivations, there may be zero negotiating power on this line. So you have to address that with your individual situation. Okay, line 147. DVA regulations limit the fees and charges buyer can pay to obtain a DVA loan. I'm not sure what that one means.
It's just a disclosure.
Yep, it's a VA
Yeah.
statement. It's a VA statement. Okay. And then line 148, Department of Veterans Affairs Escape Clause, DVA financing expressly. This is like the FHA escape clause.
Yep.
It is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract, the purchaser shall not incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money or otherwise be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described here if the contract purchase price or cost exceeds the reasonable value of this property established by the DVA. This purchaser shall, however, have the privilege and option of proceeding with the consummation of this contract without regard to the amount of reasonable value determined by the DVA. Okay, so 154 is the note. Verify DVA requirements relating to all payment of special assessments levied pending and annual installments of special assessments certified to yearly taxes. Okay, DVA has some rules.
Yep.
Every financing program has rules. So this clause is not the same, but kind of mirrors the FHA escape clause that will say the VA, because the VA will determine value, but that's typically through an appraisal, right, Carson, Pat?
Yes.
Yeah.
Entirely.
Yeah, it's
It's
not
a very different appraisal process.
Yeah, yep. And they establish value on their own and they'll tell you what they're going to lend. So, but this clause does state that the VA buyer can still proceed even though it may not match the VA's valuation, but that just tells us that it's got to be made up in other ways. Oh, consult the lender. We're not lenders, right? We got to consult lenders with complicated financing provisions like this one.
Yeah, I say that a whole lot. These
Yeah.
2-3
Yeah, we can't
pages
pretend
here
to
are
be-
all financing. Don't guess and don't try to know more than the lender.
Right. We can be smart about lending because we do a lot of these, but we're not a lender. So when in doubt, get a good lender on board and get your questions answered for the client.
Yep.
Okay. Line 156, 157. Oh, I should ask Carson, Pat, do you have any more take on VA regulation? No. Okay. I didn't think so. I was just going to keep going. Okay. Line 156, 157, other mortgage financing items. Don't see this line used a lot. Do you guys have any idea what has
No.
been stuck in here in the past? I haven't put anything in there. In the
I have
past.
not seen anything.
Okay.
I can
The
recall.
whole mortgage financing section really is pretty detailed. It covers a lot of different options.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and it's one place where I also tell agents and buyers that given that we're covering all these different options, there's going to be some blanks that are not applicable to what we are doing. And some people think everything has to be filled in, but that is not the case with this section.
I'm just going to throw this out there too, with the whole financing section. Just remember that a lot of stuff, like terms and so forth, are actually confidential information. Okay. Now, over the years, the forms have evolved, and the forms committee has done a really good job at trying to create some balance between buyers and sellers. And there's certain things that they've decided that it's important that sellers know. And there's some things that are required, like the VA escape clause and the FHA escape clause. They're just required, basically. But a lot of the stuff within the mortgage financing section, like the interest rate's not going to be more than this, or currently, are there any loan assistance programs, or is there a first mortgage or a first and a second mortgage? These are kind of things that they've decided over the years that it would be good for a seller to know. But generally speaking, remember, a lot of stuff with your clients is confidential that you don't want to share without their permission.
Well said.
Well said.
Okay. Here we go. Line 158, seller's contributions to buyer's costs. Okay. Line 159, seller is or is not contributing to buyer's costs. If the answer is, the seller agrees to pay at closing up to, and check one. Line 160, dollar amount. Line 161, percentage of the sale price. Towards buyer's closing fees, title service fees, title searches, title examinations, abstracting, lender title insurance, owner title insurance, prepaid items, or other buyer's costs allowable by the lender, if any, and or mortgage discount points, any amount of the seller contribution that exceeds the buyer's allowable costs, which cannot be used because the seller's contribution exceeds the maximum seller contribution allowed by law, or the mortgage requirements shall be retained by the seller. Okay, so this is where you put in buyer's contribution or seller's contribution to buyer's closing costs. And it depends on the situation you're in, depends on the offer, depends on the real estate climate, depends on what you think is going to be acceptable by the seller. So total negotiating point. You know, back a couple of years ago, we used to put 3% in a lot to cover the buyer on the lending side. But also there are limits in financing programs. And I think FHA set a limit, Carson, if I believe it was 6%.
Yep.
I think
Correct.
they had a 6% cap. You could ask for 6%
Yeah.
on an FHA
But-
deal, and that, go ahead.
I would never suggest determining those percentages without the lender participating in the
Absolutely.
conversation.
Of course.
Yeah.
I've always asked the lender, of course.
Yep.
So-
Yeah, I've had agents who pick out a number and then the lender's like, well, we can't use this, or where did you get
Yeah.
this number?
Yeah.
But
Are we gonna use
it's
up this
tough to
much?
negotiate in today's
Yeah.
market.
Well,
Anyway.
and the buyer's going to be probably a little grumpy at the close of the transaction if you ask for more money that they can't use, and the seller is going to
Mhm.
get a refund.
Yeah. Now they can talk with their lender, and if it turns out that they've negotiated 3%, but there's only 2.5 in closing costs, they can perhaps pay for some points to get the rate a little bit lower.
Yep. Good lender will use that money up.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions on 158 through 166? Any other thoughts
Just
on
to
that?
discuss it with a lender, and in this market, it's tough to have it work in any offer right now.
Yep. It all depends on the
Sadly.
offers. I did one
Yeah.
last year and I actually got it accepted. So, you know, you just never know in multiples. You just never know. You gotta weigh the situation.
Was that in Bloomington? Just
Yeah.
kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. Okay. Line 167, note, the amount paid by the seller cannot exceed the maximum seller contribution allowed by, just like we talked about, by FHA, DVA, or lender. All funds paid by the seller on behalf of the buyer must be stated on the closing disclosure at closing, which is important. You can't have cash exchanging outside of the closing disclosure. So that's in some cases called fraud. So you want to
Yeah.
avoid that. Okay, line 169, we're going to move on to inspections. Line 170, buyer's been made aware of the availability of property inspections, and the buyer elects or declines to have a property inspection performed at the buyer's expense. And then line 172 is important. The purchase agreement is or is not contingent upon any inspections of the property obtained by the buyer to determine its conditions, including any non-intrusive testing or any intrusive testing as allowed pursuant to this purchase agreement. Okay, so one, you can have an inspection or you don't have to. And then two, if you have an inspection, you can make the PA contingent on that inspection or not. So we've seen all kinds of variations of this in today's market climate, right? We've seen buyers have inspections and say, but we're not making the purchase agreement contingent on it. We just want to know what's happening with the property. Or we've seen, which we don't advise, we've seen buyers waive inspections completely, which that gives us the heebie-jeebies. You know, I personally have always felt that a buyer should have an inspection, whether they make the PA contingent on it or not, but that's their choice. You give them the options, they make their choices. That's what we do. And then line 175, any inspections or tests shall be done by an inspector or tester of the buyer's choice. Buyer shall satisfy buyer as to the qualifications of the inspector or tester. Now, this is important. So this clause basically states that the buyer can have anybody look at the house. Now, that sounds weird, which could be the buyer's relative. It could be a friend. I've seen non-qualified, non-inspectors use this, buyers use this to get through satisfy their own inspection needs. And I don't recommend that. you should have a qualified inspector inspect the property. Carson, what have you seen?
Oh, I agree. Although it is accurate that there is no license for an inspector. There's no governing body.
No.
But I also a place where I recommend, and I've been doing this consistently, giving them 2 or 3 names and having them contact and ask their questions. And Andrea is saying they did their own inspection, but she's got an architect on board and a lot of experience. Yep. So there are variables, but particularly with a first time buyer, and I frame it this way: the driver's education is the most important thing. Mm-hmm. What do you need to know to expect in terms of repairs and maintenance over time? And so, practiced, experienced inspector. They may have certifications and memberships and associations, but they can't have a license at this point.
Yeah, some people say they should be a member of ASHI, American Society of Home Inspectors. I mean, some people use certain qualifications for rating inspectors, but as an agent, give them 3 options. Yep. Have them make the determination and move on from there. And a good inspector, as I've always told clients, a good inspector is going to scare you. Okay. Especially if they're first time home buyers. Inspections are scary. Inspectors are technically scary because especially if it's not new construction, there's always going to be something, but we have to speak with the inspector and determine the severity of health and safety and weigh the options of getting something repaired or not. That's between the inspector and the buyer, their relationship. But I always preface it with an expectation that nothing ever sails through inspection. There's always something. So just prep your buyers for the fact that they're going to have conversation that they may find a little scary. Yeah.
In short, it's a negative process.
Yeah, that's right. It is. I mean, but like I always tell them too, it's good to know versus not know. We want to know everything. You just have to weigh what you can manage and not manage. And the inspector will help you determine that. And sometimes the inspection will trigger other inspections. It'll trigger service plans. It'll trigger a warranty. Sometimes with inspections, we counter offer with a warranty post inspection and say, look, due to the aging utilities, we would feel more comfortable with a warranty for a year. You got to find a creative solution. So let's keep going. Seller, let's see. Okay, line 179. Seller does or does not agree to allow the buyer to perform intrusive testing or inspections. Now, this is another line in the purchase agreement that back when it was a buyer's market, we used to weigh a little heavy when we wrote offers. We used to say does. And then the seller would come back and always negotiate it out and say, no, we don't want intrusive testing. And the buyer would say, oh, okay, and put it on the counter offer and let them negotiate it out. But this day and age, write with the way the offers need to be written. Just send it in how it should be. Intrusive testing, typically moisture, stucco, anything that pierces the structure, you want to get prior permission from the seller.
We can explain in Minneapolis now with the energy testing that is done, that sellers have already done one intrusive test that's rather important to establish what level of insulation there is in the walls.
Yep, they found a closet and they bored a hole in the closet and looked at the insulation. That's what they basically do. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. If the answer is does, buyer agrees that the property shall be returned to the same condition it was prior to the buyer's intrusive testing at the buyer's sole expense, which is just what Carson was talking about. Okay. Page 5. Line 182 is date. Line 183, of course, is address. Line 184, seller will provide access to attics and crawl spaces. If you're a listing agent, please remind your clients pre-inspection that they will need to make sure the crawl space is accessible. A lot of times the crawl space is sometimes screwed shut. The inspector technically cannot unscrew that. The seller has to do that for us. So make sure you let them know. They probably don't even look at it. Have them look at it, make sure it's able just to be pushed up and open or unlatched and open.
Most of the experienced inspectors that I've been seeing recently, they'll send a seller an email with those instructions and what they're going to look at and what they need access to, because the biggest thing is that attic insulation verification. And if they cannot get at it, or it's in a closet where they're not going to remove 5 years of garments and boxes to get at that panel, but you want to help them do that for your buyer.
Right, right. And a lot of times too, those attic accesses can be silicone shut. And the inspector is not going to cut that silicone and push that access open. We want to make sure the seller has that done. So, okay. Line 185 I build 10 days into every purchase agreement. Now you guys have to talk to your buyers about the inspection window and how long that should be and how that weighs in a purchase agreement. I just put 10 days in to pre-fill because that seems like that's what we put in there a lot. That allows for all inspections, tests, and resulting negotiations. So basically, from the time the PA is accepted, final acceptance date, that clock starts to run. And you got 10 calendar days to get the inspection done, get the report, negotiate the repairs. Sometimes you're going to run up on this timeline, and sometimes you're going to want to extend it because it depends on what's flagged in the inspection if you need supplemental inspections. So keep in mind that if you need this inspection window to stay open, sometimes you're going to have to sign some more documentation to extend it so you don't run out of time. And
in this market, we are seeing a number of very short inspection periods, if at all.
Yeah.
And it can be really challenging to get things done in 5 days or thereabouts, but
it really can.
It is pretty common.
Yeah, 5, 6, 7 are pretty common, and 5's pretty tight window. That's a pretty
very.
Seven.
I just had one, and it fell on a weekend, and not very many inspectors want to do much on a weekend. So that was a challenge.
So you've got to know the inspectors that you're recommending and maybe make some calls before the purchase agreement, just depending on who the buyer is going to select. And just say, what do you think? What do you think about a 5 day? Can we get it done? And then they'll help guide you when putting the correct days in line 185. Otherwise, if you start running up on time, it's a negotiating point. Submit a doc to the other side and say, we need to extend, to X days or X date, and that'll still allow the buyer to have their inspection period. Okay. Line 187, if this purchase agreement is contingent upon inspection, buyer may cancel this purchase agreement based on the inspections or test results by providing written notice to the seller or licensee representing or assisting seller of the buyer's intent to cancel no later than the end of the inspection period. If the buyer cancels this purchase agreement, buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money here paid here to be refunded to the buyer. The buyer does not cancel this purchase agreement before the end of the inspection period. This is important. Then this inspection contingency shall be deemed removed, and this purchase agreement shall be in full force and effect. That's what I was saying. If you're going to run out your window in line 185 and the buyer is still unsure through whatever the inspection process is, you better extend it, because if the clock runs out, the inspection is removed. Thoughts on that, Pat or Carson?
I'm going to add that a lot of people just simply don't understand this. The inspection contingency gives the buyer the right to cancel. It does not give the buyer the right to renegotiate. Now, the buyer—
that's an important statement.
Right.
Very important.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, actually, the buyer and the seller collectively, if they can agree, have the right to renegotiate on anything all the way up until closing. Okay. But the inspection contingency just gives the buyer the right to cancel. Having the right to cancel gives them some leverage in addition to the new information that they have found in the inspection. Gives them some leverage to renegotiate, but the seller doesn't have to agree to renegotiate.
Right. Now, that's a good point. Go ahead, Pat. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was going to say, very frequently we'll have buyers that, the inspector might tell them, or their friend or their relative might say, oh, that's something the seller has to fix. But no, it's not something the seller has to fix.
Right.
Well, and this is a whole separate class, Pat, but you and I coach agents all the time on the concept of repairing things that are hazardous or risky versus somebody asking for an improvement and trying to define the difference.
Yeah.
It can be a new thing for some buyers.
Here's the other thing that we talk about often. So if you do renegotiate, there's options. You know, the seller can do repairs, or you can have the price reduced, or maybe the seller pays some closing costs or whatever. I like the simplest way as an agent, you know, reduce the price or have the seller pay something. If you're going to ask for work to be done, please be really specific. Carson, you may remember, didn't you once get something where someone just said, they gave you an amendment that just said the furnace is old?
Yes, the furnace is beyond its reasonable. They took words out of the inspection report, and there was no specific request, so we laughed at it. And
Right.
Pat and I have seen inspection requirements that contradicted themselves on the same document. So this is where writing comes in to be a very important thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you want the furnace replaced, let's give them a brand and you know, a make and model and efficiency level and the wording that it's got to be done by licensed heating contractor with a permit, re-inspected by the city before closing with payment, proof of payment in full. Thank you. You know, you got to get into some detail there.
So on Pat's point, when you're writing an addenda for inspection response, talk to us and let's make sure it's written so the buyer has all the terms that they need.
It's got to be something that everybody understands, you know, and that a judge.
Yeah,
will
you can
understand.
you can have a pretty offended buyer if something is written that doesn't actually accomplish anything for them.
Right. Yep.
On more complex inspection times, we have used Google Docs with sophisticated, knowledgeable buyers. Rework the language. I mean, there's tools that we can use to make these things work better.
Sure.
Because it's their language in the end, not ours.
Sure. Good points. I think we could hold a whole class on inspection response. Don't you guys think? There's so many variations.
Oh yeah. We have done so and can do it again.
Yeah. And one thing that I've always used in inspection for a buyer on the buy side is that if it's a material fact and it's discovered in the inspection, if the seller decides not to either repair, negotiate, or whatever have you, that they do have to disclose that going forward.
Yes.
So that's good leverage on the buy side to say, look, we want to get this done, but just know that going forward, if we don't get a deal together, you have to disclose this to the next client. And that sometimes helps the negotiating process a little bit.
That's why listing agents don't want you to send them the entire inspection report.
They don't want to
Never
see
a good practice.
Right. Which I like sending it to them or sending them the page of reference. You know, there's no way you can cover your eyes and your ears and it's there. You better look at it. So they just don't want to have to disclose it. Okay. Line 194, other inspection items. There's a phrase I built in here to every Minnesota purchase agreement, also subject to a radon test if the buyer so elect. Simply said. So this seems to be it's more prevalent these days, and we're seeing a lot of radon up north. And we've had a lot of negotiations happen in the inspection period for radon mitigation. So something to be aware of. You know, we're right at 10:54. I think before we would head into sale of buyer's property, I think we could stop for questions. Being that we're close to an hour, does anybody have questions about the last 2.5 pages? Or all the purchase agreement for that matter of everything we've done up to page 5? Huh. Nothing.
Just remember that the answers to all questions are pretty much in the wording of the purchase agreement. Remember, this is the entire agreement between the buyer and the seller.
Go ahead, Pat.
No, that's just what I was going to say.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of our responses when it comes to another agent asking us a question about an item in the purchase agreement is, did you read it? Right? Did you read it? You know, because a lot of times the other side, they haven't read it as deep as you've read it. So, you know, of course you don't want to embarrass them, but, you know, walk them through it. Just say, hey, in line 187, it says this is pretty specific. I think this answers our question. And then, oh yeah, well, you know, they'll never make that mistake again. Right? So, okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to close early. What do you guys think?
Oh, this is good. This is good.
Yeah, we never close early, right? So let's take advantage.
Good coverage today. A lot of good points.
Yeah.
And then-
Lots of things.
We'll continue
Well
next time, starting with line 198, and we'll keep going down the purchase agreement. This is
Beautiful.
live. This is live stream on YouTube, guys. It's also going to be put up into the. I'll post a link into the private group, but also follow our. I'll send another link out too for following our YouTube page, because all of our trainings are on YouTube as well. If you want to reference those later, I know Sarah does upload a lot of her trainings and documents to the private group as well. YouTube link, just we're trying to find a real easy, fast way to be sharing trainings in and out, and we're going to start using YouTube live a little more, I think. So I appreciate all your time for being here. I know the purchase agreement's rather dry, but it is a tool that we use every day. So it's important to know line by line how this document functions, because you can best represent your client and win deals. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks.